Okay, everyone, let's talk about the French Revolution. We're actually going to talk about sort of a revolutionary era at that time that starts with the American Revolution and then follows up with the French Revolution and Napoleon and the end of Napoleon. It's kind of an interesting time period when we look at this. The American Revolution came first. The French actually supported the US, or actually supported the colonists, we're not the United States then, supported the colonists against the British in the American Revolution. There's a past precedent for the American Revolution occurring, and there's still a debate among historians as to why Americans rebelled, why only 1/3 of American colonists actually rebelled against the British. And they list a lot of the reasons why Americans sort of developed this independent spirit, even though most Americans actually didn't support the rebellion, and why it was successful. One of the things that happens, this whole notion of an American Revolution, is related to Americans sort of separating themselves from the British at that time. What had been going on earlier, I mentioned this in the previous lecture, was a war known as the 7 Years' War. That's the French and Indian War in the American colonies, or in North America, I should say. Very important war. It was expensive. The British win, the American colonies win, American colonists win. They're British at this time. Remember, American colonists are British subjects. And what happens is the Brits decide that they want to take more control over the colonies at this time. There was a lot of independence granted to American colonists. The Brits decide to take a little more control over the colonies, keep some troops there. You need to keep troops to protect the colonies as well, particularly people on the frontier. And there's also this idea among American colonists that they're on the move. Americans like to move, so they move out west. And I'm not talking about far out west, but move away from the sort of Atlantic-based colonies and move into parts of what we might call the Midwest or other territories in the Upper South. That's what happens. And so they run into problems with American Indians who are there, French who are there. They ask for assistance from colonial governments. They ask for assistance from the Brits. So that leads to some issues where the Brits decide, if you want this protection, like we protected you in the French and Indian War, you're going to have to pay for it. So the Brits start increasing taxes on the American colonies, which is kind of interesting. And it's something that the American colonists don't particularly care for. As I said, for the most part, the colonists weren't much trouble for the Brits. So throughout much of the history of colonial America, the Brits left the colonies alone. And so what colonists did is sort of establish their own legislatures, establish their own laws, tax themselves. And when you look at taxes at that time, American colonists are probably paying the lowest taxes on the planet. But when the British increased taxes, there's this idea that who allowed them to do this? No taxation without representation. That is, the new taxes are imposed without the consent of the American colonists. Now, if you look at the British system at that time, very few people can actually vote for members of parliament. So the British House of Commons says, we represent you, even though you American colonists can't vote, we represent you, so we are taxing you. One of the taxes, and the main tax that's opposed at that time, is the Stamp Act. It's not a tax on stamps per se. It's a tax on anything that requires a sort of stamp, an official license, so to speak. So it's a variety of different taxes. They even have taxes on cards, for instance. The colonists don't like this. They protest, and ultimately the British are going to back down from this. But it's not going to eliminate British control over the colonies. But there is an independent spirit that is increasing among American colonists. I mean, probably if you looked at, say, colonists in Philadelphia or elsewhere at that time, they spoke with a British accent. They sounded like they were British. But there is this sense that somehow the American colonies are distinct. So you see this idea emerging. It comes in part from liberalism. Liberalism is an ideology politically that says there should be a constitutionally based government and a government that is based on sort of representation from the people, giving people voting rights. It doesn't mean they believe in full democracy at that time. What liberals generally believe is that members who hold property should have some say-so in running governments and in deciding, say, what to tax, what laws there should be to govern the people. So that's the idea of liberalism. Representative government. Also, equality under the law is an idea as well. There is an economic version of liberalism, and that is the Thomas Paine version, that the government should leave the economy alone. We should largely have an unregulated economy. And American colonists at that time, particularly American businessmen, tend to be doing quite well. So when you look at the American colonies, they have one of the highest standards of living in the world at that time. But a number of people come along who say, you know, we really shouldn't be governed by this faraway little tiny island called Britain. We should become our own independent country. People like Thomas Paine, a colonial intellectual who writes a pamphlet called Common Sense, wondering, you know, why is this great American, colonial America being governed by this far off island? He pushes for independence in Common Sense. Thomas Jefferson as well. He's going to be the author of the Declaration of Independence. And what you begin to see, every step where the British clamp down, there are a number of American colonists who rebel and resist and rise up and write and call for independence. You know, not most people. When we look at the American Revolution, maybe a third of the American colonists supported independence, a third were indifferent, and a third of the American colonists were loyalists. That is, they supported Britain. Not hard to understand. If you have a company that's making money trading with Britain, why would you want to break away? Having a revolution is a very uncertain thing to do. I mean, who knows what the future holds? When you go to war, you don't know how these things end. And Britain has the world's most powerful navy at that time, and it's got a pretty good army. They just won the 7 Years' War, for instance. So why do colonists think that they can beat essentially the mightiest empire, the mightiest military empire in the world at that time? But nonetheless, that's what happens. With more and more things that happen, the coercive acts, they close the port of Boston. There's a Boston Tea Party you probably heard of, when the British Crown decides that a British company should be involved in the tea trade and cut out colonial tea merchants. And so you have the Boston Tea Party, and you have a number of events that occur. You know, fighting at Lexington and Concord, the Continental Congress meets, Thomas Jefferson is going to write the Declaration of Independence, and all of a sudden, there is an American Revolution that breaks out against England. It is a fairly long war, the American Revolution, and initially it does not go well for the Americans. The British have a really good military, and they got the best navy. American colonists get some assistance from the French, not because the French particularly like Americans, it's that the French hate the British. So you may have heard of the city of Lafayette. We have the Marquis de Lafayette who comes in and trains some American soldiers. The French Navy supports American colonists because they need a navy, and the French Navy is pretty good as well. And what ultimately happens is the British are going to be defeated at Yorktown. They ultimately surrender. The British basically give up on the American colonies. You know, it's just not worth the effort. They have other colonies that they make a lot more money off of. So let's just have some independent American colonies. Obviously, it's not going to be the first war with Britain. We're going to have a War of 1812, but that's something else in another course. Anyway, what happens is a Treaty of Paris is going to be agreed to in 1783 that grants the American colonies independence. That's how we get the United States of America, an independent country. Our first constitution does not go well. It's called the Articles of Confederation. A number of issues with this, particularly raising taxes and the amount of power that the federal government may have. So what they're going to hold again is another constitutional convention, and there are these issues of individual rights. When you create a more powerful government, will it be all powerful and clamp down on individual rights? So what happens to the new constitution that's created and ultimately adopted, called the Constitution, is that we had the Bill of Rights specifying individual rights. Remember, England had a Bill of Rights. We have a Bill of Rights that will be added to the Constitution, and that'll be the Constitution of America that pretty much survives until the present day with some amendments. Now on to France. France is a kind of interesting place. I just mentioned that the French supported the American colonies against the British. American colonies probably wouldn't have won without the French support. So we do have to thank the French for that. And then actually in World War I, when American troops get to France, they sort of proclaim, Lafayette, we are here. That is, we're ready to pay a debt. You helped us, we're going to help you win in World War I. But when we look at France, France is the most powerful European country. We talked about Louis XIV, absolute monarchy, Versailles, all of that stuff. The French language is the dominant language of Europe. So France just looms large as a country in Europe. It's a powerful country. Remember, Britain is sort of protected from France by its navy and because it's an island nation. But one of the things that happens with France is that, it didn't just participate in the American Revolution. Ideas from the American Revolution spread back to France, and France is going to have its own revolution. It's going to be a much more radical revolution. It's going to be a bloody revolution as well, with tens of thousands of French citizens actually dying. So it has a radical, radical face. And then it leads to a dictator taking over by the name of Napoleon. So when we look at France, we see an absolute monarchy, the old regime, ancien regime, the old regime, a divine right absolute monarchy. And what the French do is they have sort of three categories of the population. The nobility, the clergy, and the third estate is everyone else. The first two estates, the first is the clergy, the second is the nobility. The first two estates have legally based privilege. That is, there are special protections for these two groups within the French legal system. For one, they don't pay taxes. Our nobles pay very little taxes, but let's just say for the most part, they don't pay taxes. Now, the third estate simply means commoners, or really everyone who is not in the first or second estate. That is, everyone who's not a member of the clergy and everyone who's not a noble. They're in the third estate and they pay the bulk of the taxes. Some members of the third estate are actually quite wealthy. They're rich businessmen, they're lawyers, but the bulk of the third estate are just ordinary peasants who are struggling to survive. That's how France is divided on the eve of the revolution. There is a middle class. Middle class resents having to pay most of the taxes. And when we look at the tax system, that's a pretty flawed system that's going on in France. And up to the French Revolution, we see a French crown that is very much in debt, very much in debt. It can't collect enough in taxes. It uses things called tax formers to go out and pays people to collect taxes. They get to keep a percentage of the taxes when they collect taxes. So you're not even collecting all the taxes that are due to France. Plus, the church is the biggest landowner in France. The nobility is wealthy and they're free from paying taxes. They don't have to pay taxes. So you have a flawed tax base. And what's going on by the time of the French Revolution is about half the tax revenue is going just to pay interest on the debt. Imagine if you have debt at home or credit card debt or something, and you're only able to pay interest on that. So the debt just keeps building and building and building, and interest payments keep going up and up and up and up as well. Does that stop the French monarchy from spending money? No, they spend a lot of money on the American Revolution, for instance, and other wars. Spend a lot of money on Versailles. Another thing that's going on at this time, there's going to be a series of bad harvests leading up to the French Revolution. And so agricultural yields decline. That is, peasants are hungry. The price of food skyrockets and peasants are hungry. So we're going to see educated people who talk about liberty and equality under the law and representative government. Most of the third estate are peasants. They just want food to eat. They're not guided by any lofty ideals. They're just hungry. They're motivated by by other reasons than some of the liberal treatises that are written by intellectuals and the philosophes at that time. So let's look at Louis XVI, a weak king. He's an absolutist, but he's a weak king. Claims to be God's representative on earth, but he's a weak king. He's married to Marie Antoinette. All kinds of rumors about him, rumors of impotence because for a while they couldn't produce an heir, and all kinds of jokes about Louis XVI among the French people. So he's not a highly respected king of France. Even Marie Antoinette wasn't all that taken with him initially, but they have a nice marriage and they try to make things work. There's Louis. He looks good. There he is in all his royal regalia, and there's Marie Antoinette. There she is. They ultimately have some kids as well, by the way. But there's Marie, there's her children, there's the royal court. There they are at Versailles. That's an amazing, impressive palace to live in. There it is. You can see Versailles, some of these impressive things. What's going on at this time? Well, Louis is living it up and peasants are hungry. You've got a lot of ideas spreading around. Remember, we had some philosophers like John Locke and his idea of liberalism. People have a right to life, liberty, and property. Thomas Jefferson says the pursuit of happiness instead of property in the Declaration of Independence. Kind of a cool thing. Americans have a right to be happy. Montesquieu, we talked about a separation of powers. Think of America. We end up with a president and a House of Representatives and Senate and the judicial system, the Supreme Court. So there are a lot of people in France who are familiar with ideas calling for a change in governmental reform. Again, it's not necessarily democracy, although the French are going to try that out. Most people do call for reforms. A lot of educated people do, not necessarily the nobility or the clergy. Those are very conservative institutions. And when you're privileged, you're not asking for much change. And as I said earlier, poor people don't really talk about reform. They're just hungry. They want enough to eat. They don't want to pay too much for food. So we talked about this debt, massive debt. Louis tries to deal with it. He convenes an assembly of notables, the first two estates, clergy and nobles, to try to handle the debt situation, broaden the tax base. They don't do anything. Instead, they say you have to call this body into session known as the Estates General that represents the three estates in France, the clergy, nobility, and the third estate, everybody else. They haven't met in almost 2 centuries, not quite, almost 2 centuries. But they convene. People are elected. They choose delegates to sit. There's a big issue over voting. Do you vote by estate? That means each estate gets 1 vote. And that way, the clergy and the nobility would probably vote alike and outvote the third estate. Or do you vote by head, a head count? The third estate has more members of it than the nobility and the clergy. They want to vote by head. And there's this whole notion, what should France become? What should we be? There's just like the American colonists had a number of intellectuals guiding their revolution, you see that in France. What is the third estate? What is the third estate, says Abbé Sieyès? It is the nation. Who are the true representatives of the nation, says Abbé Sieyès? It's the third estate. Not these parasites who live off the system, but those who contribute, the majority of the population. And we're going to begin to see the third estate is going to make some moves, and it's going to lead to a revolution. One of the things that happens is the third estate gets locked out of a meeting place, so they try to convene at a tennis court, an unused tennis court, and they convene there and they declare themselves the National Assembly and agree to something known as the Tennis Court Oath. That is, they agree to meet and write a constitution for a representative form of government. It'll be a constitutional monarchy, like Britain, so to speak, a representative form of government that changes from absolute monarchy to constitutional monarchy. They're going to meet and produce a constitution. Meanwhile, bad harvests, rumors, all kinds of things are swirling around France, causing issues. So while the third estate is creating the National Assembly, an assembly theoretically that represents the true nation of France, events elsewhere get out of control. The Bastille, a royal prison in Paris, is stormed and destroyed. They're looking to free some prisoners, and these are Parisian mobs looking to get some weapons as well. In the countryside, there's something known as the Great Fear, where peasants go around destroying the manors and the houses and property of the nobles, destroying all kinds of documents in the countryside that show the peasants have to pay these taxes and perform all these duties, for instance. So these are people who are guided by other ideas, who are causing trouble. And what the National Assembly is going to have to do is issue something known as the Declaration of Rights of Man, of the rights of man and citizen, to sort of calm down the situation and let people know that, hey, we're going to write a constitution, we're going to change France. And basically, the Declaration of Rights of Man is kind of like the Declaration of Independence. It's a statement of principles of liberal representative government. It promotes equality under the law, says there would be a representative government, and it talks about individual freedoms for French citizens. Olympe de Gouges, by the way, an early feminist, Olympe de Gouges is going to write Declaration of the Rights of Man and Woman, in which she basically says all of these rights should apply to women as well. And women are kind of important in this. One of the things going on at this time, while all of these events are going on, there's going to be a march of women to Versailles to try to bring the king and queen back to Paris so that they can see all the problems going on, so they can see how expensive bread is, how tough it is to take care of their family. And they do that. Here you can see the Tennis Court Oath, the recreation of that, and these ideas, which present some problems: liberty, égalité, equality, fraternity, or death. Liberty, equality, brotherhood, or death. There's some issues there with that, which we're going to talk about there. The women are very violent. There's some issues going on with all of this stuff. I mean, think about this: liberty, equality, and fraternity. Those are nice ideals, Liberty and equality are often at odds. While one of the things that happens is, and we know that with people, is that all people aren't necessarily equal in talents and ability. And some people are going to come along and say, well, we need to make everyone equal so that no one is better off than anyone else. That's going to lead to some interesting ideas and new theories later on, like communism, that emerges, because liberty and equality are at odds. The more freedom you give someone, the more likely the most talented or whatever rise to the top in society. So that's a challenge that happens. But ultimately, back to the National Assembly, they do create a new constitution, turn France into a constitutional monarchy. They create a legislative assembly that limits the vote for this assembly to people who have property, and they abolish the nobility, the privileges of the nobility. That's gone. They also go a bit too far here with the civil constitution of the clergy, which is condemned by the Pope, not the Pop, the Pope, add an E to that. Civil constitution of the clergy, it basically makes the French church a national church, a church run by the government. Imagine that priests and bishops are going to be elected. They take property from the church so they can sell it and raise some money, but it's a national institution. And the government is going to pay for the salaries of some of these church officials. Women's rights, they do give women some additional rights, some financial support for those women, single mothers, for instance, additional rights of divorce, but not a lot of rights for women. One of the interesting things is France is a Catholic country, but Jews are told to come out of the ghettos. The ghettos were places where Jews lived. Jews were segregated in society. Come out, you're a French citizen. And also equality for Protestants as well. And they adopt a new national anthem, La Marseillaise. These are just some aspects of the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Kind of interesting. These are the words of the La Marseillaise, if you want, La Marseillaise, if you want to learn about that. It's kind of interesting. To arms, or Day of Glory has arrived, against the bloody flag of tyranny, all of this stuff. As I mentioned earlier, there's a feminist who's around at that time. There are a number of them, by the way. This one is Olympe de Gouges, who writes the Declaration of the Rights of Woman, in which she basically responds to every line of the Declaration of the Rights of Man with the word woman. So if you go back to the Declaration of the Rights of Man, men are born free and remain free and equal in rights. Woman is born free and lives equal to man in her rights. Social distinctions can be based only on the common utility. So she very much promotes this whole notion of equality for women. Later on, in the radical phase of the French Revolution, she's going to be killed. She's going to be guillotined. But anyway, there is a response to this from conservatives, and it happens in England. Edmund Burke, Conservatism, which he writes Reflections on the Revolution in France. And he's kind of predicting what's going to happen. The French have all these ideas about this new government, this new world that's going to be created. And Edmund Burke says, you better be careful. If you break too much with the past and this notion of accumulated wisdom and knowledge, if you eliminate that, it could lead to a lot of danger, particularly this notion of equality. That's a fantasy, and we still wonder about that. What is equality? Is it theoretical equality under the law? Or is it genuine equality where nobody is better off than anyone else? What do you mean by that? And that's a challenge. You have different ideas from different political theorists. If you look at America or other countries, there are vast differences in wealth in America. We seem to accept a lot of that. Some countries think, no, that means your society is unequal. We shouldn't have this disparity in wealth, that sort of thing. So how do you create equality? It's a challenge. And one of the things we find in those societies that try to be more equal, they tend to be less free as well. But Edmund Burke, be careful. Revolutions are dangerous. They're almost always just pure destruction. And he actually predicts that this revolution will go violent, turn violent, and that's what it does. There are a number of events that lead to this. The royal family tries to escape France and get assistance in Austria and Prussia. They're going to be captured and basically placed under house arrest. The Austrians and Prussians, Marie Antoinette comes from Austria, they're not happy with this. They're not happy with these changes. Why? They don't want their own people to get ideas about overthrowing them, about ending absolute monarchy. So they issue the Declaration of Pillnitz, which says, if you don't restore absolute monarchy, we will invade. The Legislative Assembly simply declares, oh yeah, we declare war on you. So they go to war. And this war radicalizes the revolution. They're a group of political radicals, revolutionary radicals known as Jacobins. Those are the revolutionary radicals, calling for more reforms, many of them calling for the creation of true equality, calling for democracy and true equality. And they're allied with poor people. Poor people are just called sans-culottes. Culottes refers to pants. They wear pants that the nobles don't wear. So that is, nobles wear culottes, they don't. So they're called the sans means without culottes. And the king's in prison. And what happens with this is the Jacobins take over, seize power, and declare we need a new government. So they abolish this monarchy and they come up with this idea that France should be a democracy based on universal manhood suffrage. That is, men given the right to vote. Notice when they talk about equality, they're not talking about giving women the right to vote just yet. That is a 20th century phenomenon, and one that happens in Europe and America first. Well, actually, I think it happens in New Zealand first, but it's not everywhere. So what they do is create a new government, a democracy, create an institution called the National Convention. That's their parliament. The monarchy is abolished. The king's under house arrest. And they pass laws that guarantee work, the right to live, subsistence, the right to rebel against tyranny, all these lofty sounding things that are hard to implement. And what happens is power is going to be given to a particular group of people known as the Committee of Public Safety. That sounds rather harmless. The Committee of Public Safety, there was one individual, a guy by the name of Maximilien Robespierre, who seizes power over the Committee of Public Safety. And he is a radical Jacobin. He says the revolution must go far, far, far. We must establish a republic of virtue. Never really says what a republic of virtue is, but he says a virtue means eliminating your enemies. So you can't achieve virtue without bloodshed, is what he says. So it's kind of an interesting comment. You have to kill people to become virtuous. But that's the way some ideologues think. He's very much a modern leader, like a modern style dictator who uses a lot of propaganda that sounds virtuous, but ends in a lot of bloodshed. So you have these issues going on, and there's a war going on. What else is going on? The economy's still in shambles. It's not like this revolution has lowered the price of food or increased agricultural yields. It's pure chaos. It leads to instability. And so that's why we're going to see this new government under Robespierre taking control over the economy, as much control as possible, instituting wage and price controls. To fight the wars that are going on, they draft all adult men into the military. And France has this massive, massive military, massive army that it sends to fight the Prussians and the Austrians. One of the things that happens is the Austrians and Prussians train. They have a lot of military discipline. And these new French armies, it's kind of like a scene out of the Wild West, where they just give the French very little training, give them guns, send them in the battle, and they start running around all over the battlefield, just shooting and firing. Now, you might think a highly disciplined military would defeat them. It causes a lot of chaos, and the Prussians and the Austrians don't know what the hell to do with these French troops that are just running all over the place. The French actually begin to win on the battlefield because they overwhelm the Prussians with crazy tactics and with sheer numbers. Meanwhile, at home, there are enemies of the revolution, says Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety. We must eliminate them. So they have revolutionary tribunals, special courts that surveil the population, look at them and start coming up with lists of people who are enemies of this new republic. And this republic of virtue is going to be established, or they're going to try to establish. What they basically say is the old way of life must be completely dismantled or disrupted, you may have heard those terms today, and replaced with something brand new. So even the calendar must be changed. 1793 becomes the new year one. There are new days of the week that they have. Each month has a new name, like Fructidor and Thermidor. Weeks have 10 days, so you only have one day off after 9 days of work. They adopt the metric system, the system of weights and measures based on units of 10. Because it sounds rational. That's what we should do. They encourage people to get rid of those old Christian names you have. Call each other citizen, or give each other a name that sounds like something useful. So you hear or something that's part of nature. So you hear French citizens, these revolutionaries, naming their children like dandelion and cabbage and stuff like that, all this bizarre stuff that's going on. But the whole notion is that the reality that existed before must be completely overturned. Um, they're going to de-emphasize religion and try to close as many churches as they can, and sell as much church land as they can. Most French people are religious. The church is important to them. So when members of the government go to close down a church, they resist. What happens when they resist and complain? They are called enemies of the republic, and they're going to be beheaded. They're going to be killed. That's how you determine who's an enemy of the republic. Anybody who opposes whatever you're doing. Notre Dame, that beautiful, beautiful cathedral in Paris, it becomes a temple of reason where you're supposed to go over there and think rationally or something. You know, they damage part of it. They cut the heads off of statues and all this, you know, just things that are going to irritate people. And this reign of terror is something that the Committee of Public Safety implements. Think about that. It's called public safety, but it implements a reign of terror to make France safer and to make France more virtuous. Notice how revolutionary leaders essentially change the meaning of words and basically lie to you. A reign of terror is not virtuous, you know, for instance, but that's what Robespierre believes it is. And who are the enemies? Basically a bunch of peasants, people who oppose the religious changes. So they run around shooting people. The military gets involved in parts of France where there are some rebellions against the government, send in the military and just slaughter people. They kill a lot of priests. And in parts of France, they implement the reign of terror using that device. That is a guillotine. The guillotine, by the way, or the guillotine, was invented not by Dr. Guillotin, but I think he improved it and had his name attached to it. But this device is first devised as a humanitarian device for swift, quick, and painless death. So the blade comes down and cuts your head off in a clean, quick manner, which is not necessarily something that used to occur when you had the executioner who would come in and you'd be lying down and it would take a few hacks at you, at your neck, and hopefully eventually your head would cut off. And if you've got a drunk executioner, who knows where the axe will hit you and what if the axe is dull, all of this stuff. So that's a pretty bloody affair. It was a device invented for the beheadings of the nobility and members of the clergy. But in the French Revolution, since equality reigns, you can behead peasants as well. So in Paris, you have guillotines placed around Paris, and you would have a lot of public spectacles going on where you would have an event to go out there and watch people get their heads cut off, and they'd sell food and you'd have crowds gather and all this. And lots of people got their heads cut off, including Olympe de Gouges and King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette as well, and that guy as well. What happens in revolutions when they turn radical? One of the things that happens in revolutions, and you see this over and over, is that the revolutionaries who start the bloodbaths themselves are going to be killed by others who react against them. And there's Robespierre. He's going to be shouted down. Why? Because people are afraid. Who's next? Robespierre is calling everybody an enemy of the Republic. And he's going to be shouted down and sent to the guillotine. And you're going to have a conservative reaction called the Thermidorian reaction. Thermidor was name of a month, where basically conservatives and businessmen take over. It becomes a more moderate phase. The radical phase is over. The price control over the economy is over. And they gain control of the military. There's a body called the Directory and a two-house legislature, but voting rights are limited. They control the military, and the military is going to be used domestically against enemies of the Directory and abroad to fight wars. And one of the commanders who emerges during this time is a guy by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte, who is from Corsica, an island where they were only recently given French citizenship. He rises in rank in the French military and becomes a great, great commander. And we will stop right there.